So here's what happened. For months I had been planning what I believed to be the most difficult section of the Tahoe-Yosemite Trail, days 6 through 8, from Carson Pass to Lake Alpine. I'll save the difficulty description for when I actually hike it, but up until this point my research had indicated that it involved long sections of off-trail that even Thomas Winnett, author of the original Tahoe-Yosemite Trail book, described as sketchy. This route also included several water crossings, one of them quite deep, even without the record-breaking snowfall of 2023. Well, so far so good. The first strike against this trip was that the earliest I was able to plan it was late October due to work commitments. The second was when my hiking buddy Discord, who I had been planning this hike with, had to bail on the trip. At this point I was still planning to try it solo, but after 2 weeks of fair weather predictions, the day before my planned departure, the weather report went from sunny and cold to rainy, with temperatures dropping into the mid-teens the night/morning before the major river crossing. I decided God was trying to tell me something and called the trip off. Since this would likely be my last good chance at a fall backpacking trip, and I already had the days off, I decided to do a shorter reconnaissance trip to scout out the end of what I consider to be the next TYT section. It was an odd-looking area with numerous routes indicated in every resource I had. Further, this seemingly short, about 4-mile route was described in fairly cautious terms by most of those sources. Winnett himself said that there was more than one route here, but he thought his was the safest. However, Winnett himself changed the route between editions of the Tahoe-Yosemite Trail book. In the old school website that I have also been consulting for this trip, they also spoke in terms of caution and needing some particular skills to get through this area. I decided to see what all the fuss was about. The trip begins by crossing over St. Mary's Pass from a trail whose trailhead is literally just a few feet off of Highway 108 near Sonora Pass. The trail, which is labeled Stanislaus Peak Trail on some maps, begins with an 800-foot uphill mile. Then it's time to simply turn left and head off trail for the remainder of the hike. There were several options at this point. The CalTopo GPS route that I have used occasionally offered no less than 3 or 4, depending on how you count the routes. There was a yellow and orange route that was labeled actual. I assumed that that is the route that the map maker took. And then there was a blue Winnett route and a purplish-pink alternate route. Upon arrival at the turnoff from the trail, I could not see any major advantages to any of them, and they were relatively close to each other. So I got as close to the blue Winnett route as I could. My goal from the trail turnoff was just to get to what I was calling the brown mound that I had seen in the satellite image on Google Earth. It turned out to be a fairly prominent feature on the landscape, so it was no problem descending from the trail, jumping over the creek, climbing up the other side of the canyon, and to the brown mound. I then headed in a generally northwest direction through a small high desert looking area, then to an overlook at the edge of the Great Bowl where I stopped for a snack. From here I could see Clark Fork Meadow in the distance, which was my goal for the day. To my left was the southern rocky expanse that I was supposed to arc around in order, I suppose, to avoid a bunch of scrambling. There were 2 prominent routes on the CalTopo GPS map called St. Mary's Winnett in blue and St. Maddie's, I think that was a typo, alternate in pinkish purple. I decided to try to stick to the blue route as it looked closest to Winnett's original TYT route, and because it made sense to basically stay as close to the rocks as possible to save on distance while not having to lose time scrambling over all the mini canyons they formed, as fun as that would be. There are 7 or 8 major rocky areas clumped together to form the bowl's edge. They are beautiful, and exploring them would be worth the hike by themselves. I actually went back and forth from the official Winnett route to the rocks numerous times because they were just too cool, and the views at their edge were fantastic. I ended the mile or so long traverse in one of several steep creek canyons and eventually emerged into the forest where it was time to make the big northward turn toward Clark Fork Meadow. I could tell from the map that this turn was hemmed in by a creek which made navigation fairly simple. What I missed was the elevation drop this seemingly small section involved. You drop about 600 feet in about a half a mile. Not a big problem going down, but between route finding and carrying a big backpack, coming back up it would be challenging. There isn't much to do but go down and try not to fall. The creek is worth keeping an eye on as it is quite beautiful. It's very rocky, so there are lots of little waterfalls, and in places gives you a preview of the amazing canyon falls below on the north side of the meadow. I crossed the creek twice to avoid bushwhacking, but it wasn't strictly necessary. I recommend crossing from east to west banks when you reach the heavy brush, then continuing down the west slope as the creek expands into a seriously steep canyon. Once the creek crossings become manageable again, then either traverse down to the meadow or recross the creek once and head straight down to follow the more Winnet-like route. Once I reached the floor of Clark Fork Meadow, here again when its routes differed. One had the hiker cross the creek that forms the southern edge of the meadow and then head left up to its northern boundary. The other kept to the south side of the creek and did not cross the creek until you reached the northern edge. I crossed the creek, figuring how much difference could there be. The meadow was fine, although it wasn't the grassy kind that I was hoping it would be, instead covered with low-lying bushy plants, but I enjoyed hiking across it until I found myself in standing water. As it turns out, meadows at the bottom of giant mountain bowls tend to become lakes in record snowfall years. Who knew? Clark Fork Meadow was no different, and I decided to cut across it to the south, recross the creek, and get up on the elevated edge of the bowl to work my way around to the north, where some trees and rocks look like a great place to make camp. So, after yet another creek crossing, I found myself high and dry and back in the dirt. The whole area looked good, but something kept me searching. I followed the sound of falls and discovered a perfect area with 2 to 3 camping spots right next to one of the greatest box canyon falls I'd ever seen. Now, I was obviously not the first to stop here, as I found campfire rings and remnants of old camp gear, some of which I was able to clean up, but I had the place to myself and did not see another hiker for the entirety of the time I was there. I set up my camp, made dinner, and kicked back at the top of a 30-foot waterfall as the sun disappeared behind the soaring cliffs above me. Not a bad way to end the day. The night was fairly unremarkable. It was cold, but not uncomfortable. After breakfast, I rock-hopped over to the other side of the creek and headed down the canyon a bit to see if I could pick up the TYT coming from the north. The canyon below the bowl drops off steeply following the creek among many rocky paths. I found enough ducks to be confident that the route was followable, and once I had descended 100 feet or so, I turned around and followed it back up. When I hiked out, I would follow the rest of this trail to what is marked as Trail End on the map and see that the trail simply faded away with no drama whatsoever. Now, I had taken a total of 3 days off from work, and I was not sure if I wanted to hang around or head home. By mid-morning, I had accomplished all I wanted to do on this trip, and I am not much into solo camping, but I was still considering just taking the day off to poke around the area since it was so epically beautiful. However, the sketchy clouds I had been watching for an hour or so started to turn even darker, and the wind became more continuous and colder. I had a strong sense that it was time to go, so I packed up while I could still do so in dry conditions and hit the trail. Now that I had turned around, I was basically hiking what would have been the last day of the section that I planned to do after the Carson Pass Lake Alpine hike that I had skipped. Knowing the hills that were ahead, I decided to intentionally hike slowly and carefully. I stayed on the edge of the meadow, past the wonderful waterfall that marked the time to start looking for an upward route, and once I reached the creek that I would follow up to the turn around the rocks, I was up about 50 feet above the meadow. Rather than cross the creek here, I followed vague use trails and rare ducks up the northern slope until I got past the seriously steep canyon to the bushy area, then crossed to the southern side. When I arrived at the beginning of the turn away from the forest and toward the rocks, I was greeted by a cold blast of wind carrying snow. I dropped my pack and got my trusty Frog Togs rain jacket and put my rain kilt in my pocket for quick access should it come to that. In order to spend the least amount of time in the storm as I could, I wanted to avoid climbing up the sandy canyons and scrambling up and around the rocks I had come down the day before, so I chose to take a wider arc around the rocks, which is possibly following the Caltopo Purple alternate route. This involved a lot of hilly, sandy climbing, but nothing difficult or technical. I came out much closer to the snow-laden pass edge than I had come in on, and I hiked to the top of its lower shoulder just to see the view. It was nice, but it was also much colder, and the wind snow was not letting up. So I put on the rain kilt and made for the area that I thought of as Domino Rocks on my way in. I ended up walking right to them, and this meant it was time to head over the pass and aim for Brown Mound. Long story short, the weather held steady, which wasn't too bad. I actually appreciated the cold as it kept me from swamping out under my jacket, and I was able to retrace my incoming route pretty easily. Once I reached Brown Mound, I gave up the Winnett alternate actual routes entirely and just made a beeline for the lowest point on the trail that I could see from my vantage point. Either way, reaching the trail meant climbing down and then up the intervening canyon, so I thought, why bother climbing higher just to add more downhill? I finally got to the trail and followed it down the final mile while white dust accumulated across the ground cover. I completed the hike in just under 4 hours, which surprised me as I thought I'd been hiking a lot slower. All in all, I was very glad to have become familiar with this area before hiking into it at the tail end of its long section. It is an area not to be feared, but one that is to be respected.